Hey everyone, it's Mike with Blue Ridge Bigfoot. Here we are again on a nice Wednesday. Looks like the weather will hold out, give us some fair, decent temperatures in the 60s. This is the type of weather I love about Virginia. Fall is almost here. Hey, let's go ahead and get into our story. It's called A Terrifying Encounter with Bigfoot. So let's go ahead and get into it. Ever had your world turned upside down? Well, I have, literally. I had an up-close and personal encounter with a Bigfoot that had a bad attitude. The shocking part was it happened in my backyard. I'd always thought Bigfoot were out west. Since this happened, it's hard for me to forget. There's a saying that I've read recently and it keeps popping up all the time. The quote goes, "I'm a believer in Bigfoot." Well, a believer is someone with religious faith and with that wholeheartedly believes in something spiritual and that nothing can shake their beliefs. I am what you call a knower. I heard it, I saw it, I smelled it, and almost died by its hands. Bigfoot is real. I know what I saw, so I guess I'm what you call a knower. In spring of 1990, I was planning to build a cabin on my father's property in Bedford County, Virginia. He had one giant parcel of land and had no interest in selling any of it. So we worked out an agreement. The property had a little bit of everything. Picturesque views of the Blue Ridge Mountains, rolling hills, pastures, a stream, and a forest. As a kid, my older brother and I would run all over the place. We'd fish, ride our bikes on the dirt roads, play cowboys and Indians and hide in and around the hills, catch lightning bugs in the summer, build forts in the woods. Sometimes we'd find a lone giant teepee when we'd gather wood for our forts. Now, when I say giant, I mean giant. This was private property, and we never saw anyone on the farm unless they were with my dad. 2 little boys or 10 grown adults could never take 30-foot trees and lean them together in the middle of the woods. And there was always a foul animal odor around these teepees. Kind of reminded me of urine. And it would linger and almost seem to spread. I recall my brother telling me he thought that the structures were markers. He said they were made by the ghosts of the Chickahominy Indians. I didn't even know what he was talking about, but I would always want to stay away from those teepees whenever possible. Aside from the teepees, we'd hear howls on occasion, but we were convinced they were probably coyotes. What else could it be? As I grew up and eventually moved off to college, I relocated to Maine and got married. Well, I made my way back home to Virginia 14 years later when things didn't work out. It was now my son and I living with my dad. That's when, after numerous conversations with my dad and securing the loans, he decided to let me pick out a plot of land and build on it. You probably know that the process can be lengthy. Once things got rolling, clearing a spot, we were going to be very busy throughout this process. The lot we chose to build on was about a mile away from my dad's. It would be nestled among the trees, and the front porch would have a view of some rolling hills and the distant Blue Ridge Mountains. You're probably wondering why I chose this spot with what I've already told you. Well, I chose this spot because it was the most scenic and desirable location on the property. So many years have passed, and with so much on my mind, I must have forgotten or blocked it out. But as we surveyed the plot, I hired a crew to take down trees. After a few weeks, the clearing began to take form. We had all of the trees stacked and would have them cut and split for firewood. On one random evening, one of the contractors knocked on the door. He was an older man and leader of the crew. He said he worked the last 2 hours by himself because of the noises coming from inside the woods. I was puzzled and had no idea what he was talking about. Well, he enlightened me. He said he was from Brazil and claimed to know what was making the noises. His English was difficult to understand. We just called him Beto because we couldn't pronounce his first name. Anyway, in his best English, he claimed the noises came from something called a mapinguari. At least that's what it was called when he was a child living in a village on the outskirts of the Amazon rainforest. He and his brothers and younger sister had seen it once on the banks of the Negro River. It was on the other side of the river, and it was screaming at them. It was as tall as his father, maybe close to 6 feet, brown in color and hairy all over. They were terrified and fled home. He later thought it was being territorial because he and the other kids were throwing rocks in the river. Beto commented, "It's best to leave them alone and give them space. My people have seen the Mapinguari, and they give it space and respect." Beto said it felt like a flashback when he heard it today. The lot was almost cleared and their job practically completed. Another day or two and they'd be gone. The next day, I brought my deer rifle down to the lot and supervised them. I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary over those few days. Once the stumps were removed, things came to a screeching halt. It's always about money. I needed more. And now my project was on temporary hold. I had also wanted to revisit the blueprints and make some plan changes as possible. Summer came and almost went before I realized I was spending too much time at work and then coming home and working some more on the house. Being a single dad was tough right now. I'd luckily had the help of my father. I came up with a plan and thought we'd build a fire, roast some hot dogs, and set up a tent in my dad's backyard. The cool summer nights and starlit sky made for a picturesque evening. This was ideal for camping weather. Right around midnight, we called it a night and put out the fire. I remember the tent my dad loaned us was quite large, much bigger than what we needed for the two of us, so there was plenty of room to stretch out. The next thing I remember was being woken up out of a deep sleep and floating in the air. I think it was my son that came crashing down on me as we tumbled. I then crashed into one of the tent walls. It was pitch dark, obviously, and all I could do was yell for my son. "Eric! Eric! Dad!" Eric was muffled as he'd crouched down inside his sleeping bag when the tent began to roll. At one point, Eric screamed, "What's going on?" I'm pretty sure the tent only rolled or flipped once, but the ride wasn't over. We were now being pulled along the ground. I could hear scraping and feel the bottom of the tent going over rocks and branches and grass. I began yelling, "Hey, hey, hey!" But we kept going. After scrambling out of my sleeping bag and grabbing onto my son, I searched for the flashlight. After at least a minute, the tent finally came to a stop. It was quiet. There was no noise to be heard outside, and I still couldn't find that flashlight. I didn't know what my next step was. I wasn't armed, no reason to be. It was just supposed to be a night in the tent in the backyard. I eventually found the opening of the tent. I slowly poked my head out to see where we were and if anything was around. I thought I could see the light of Dad's house as I scanned around. It was probably less than 100 yards away. Once we squirmed free, with no shoes on and no chance or time to look for them, I told my son that we were going to run as fast as we could toward Grandpa's back door. 1, 2, 3, go! As we ran and held hands, we both heard something. It sounded like excited chatter. The volume was loud, but yet far enough away. We made it to the back porch and in the house. I remember my son and I both had tears in our eyes. We truly felt panic. After we all talked for a while, I finally got him calmed down and in bed, but I decided to stay up and keep a lookout. I was now armed and watching through the kitchen door. We were clueless about what was happening. I remember Beto's story, but I was still doubtful. I didn't hear what he heard, and I definitely didn't see it. I felt like this may have been someone pulling a joke on us. The next day, I traveled down the dirt road to check on the cleared lot. As I arrived, things didn't look right. The pile of trees were no longer in a pile. They were spread out. Some were as far as 50 feet from the original pile. It almost looked as if someone had a temper tantrum and scattered them everywhere all over the empty lot. I think the realization truly hit me in the head like a sledgehammer when I saw among the dirt and sawdust tracks of very large footprints. I wear a size 11, and they were easily twice my size and a size and a half wider than my foot. One after the other, these prints went into the woods and seemed to come back out into the clearing. My blood ran cold and I felt a little dizzy as I suddenly recalled the teepee structures that were back there somewhere, and we found them as small kids. It was all coming back to me. This creature was not happy, and I was most likely the cause. Well, if you've ever discovered a pest in your house and wanted to do anything you could to get rid of it, that's what was running through my head. Get rid of it. So I made a phone call to my big brother and explained to him that I needed a favor. And he called a few friends, and so did I. We planned on meeting the next morning at sunrise in front of the cleared out lot. I explained what had happened over the course of a few months and going back to our childhood. Everyone had at least a deer rifle. Some brought a backup revolver. We spread out in a line from the lot and moved in. The plan was to fan out, but still hold the line. After walking several hundred feet deep, we came upon a teepee structure. I spotted and knew what it was immediately. It was much smaller than the ones we'd seen when we were kids. Just as I turned around to my brother on my right side to point it out, he suddenly went down with a thud. He groaned and grabbed at his back. Ah! I motioned to one of my friends who came over to attend to him. As he bent down to help my brother, a big rock flew almost directly over his head and landed at his side and rolled into a tree with a thud. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" my friend Kirk said. "I don't know. I'm not sure." And as I finished my sentence, directly in front of me, at about 100 feet out, I could see something. A dark figure moving towards us through the trees. "Do you see that? Is that it? I've got it. Say goodbye." Kirk dropped his rifle and pulled out his revolver. I was waiting for the shot, but there wasn't one. He just stood there like a statue. "Shoot!" I yelled at him. I held up my rifle and aimed at the same tall, dark figure that crept closer with each step. And then I saw what Kirk was already aware of. We were hopelessly outnumbered. Behind the biggest one were several more, and they began to fan out. And they moved with an almost effortless speed, jumping and bounding off trees until they formed a crude semicircle around us, leaving us an exit and go back the way we came. "Okay, I think we need to go, Kirk. Kirk, let's go." I looked around for the remainder of our group, only to see them running back towards the clearing. Kirk and I lowered our guns and helped grab my brother by a leg or arm and slowly move out. There were many strange things that took place in that short amount of time, but the one that stuck out to me was the silence. There wasn't any screaming or acts of intimidation. No bluff charges. These creatures were standing their ground. This was their home. The initial screaming when the trees were cut down was probably a warning. Strike one. The turning over of the tent and dragging me and my son in it was probably strike two. And this, well, was strike three. Thinking there was only one of these creatures was our biggest mistake. If Kirk would have pulled that trigger, thinking what we all thought, that there was only one, we would have been torn apart. No one would have been spared. Kirk saved our lives by not shooting. My brother had several bruised ribs. Our egos were also badly bruised. No one talked about the incident. It was like it never happened. And speaking of never happening, after all of this, I took the advice of my contractor, Beto. He was right. These things need space and respect. Thanks, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the story. We'll catch you next Wednesday. Have a great week.